Hello and welcome to The Appetite, a podcast brought to you by Opal Food and Body Wisdom, an eating disorder treatment center in Seattle, Washington. I'm your host, Carter Umhau, a therapist, artist, and writer. And today I'm sitting down with all of Opal's co-founders, Lexi Giblin, Bazzi, and Julie Church. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So we are all talking about kind of the process of grief and letting go today. And this topic comes at a time in our world, for sure, where there is a lot of letting go that needs to be happening as the world around us is changing so drastically. That comes with a lot of grief, that comes with a lot of need to adapt and to try and understand what's next. And we also have some upcoming changes within the podcast itself. And so as a launching point into the conversation, we wanted to share a little bit about that and talk at length conversationally about sort of the different feelings and themes that come up with the process of letting go itself.
Okay. I notice that I'm feeling emotional, like having sad feelings as we're recording this today, because something that is changing is that Carter is no longer going to host the podcast. And this is our last time recording together.
Yeah, it's the last of the four of us together. I think from this recording, I've got one more interview to do, and you all will go on without me. And that sounds very much like the Titanic, but I think I'm using humor to not feel things. But I know I am feeling a lot of that too. And it's so strange to be recording at home still. When we sat down to record our first episode of the pandemic in March, I think I was recording from my bed for some reason. And I don't think I had a desk yet. And I thought, oh, this is just temporary. And now here we've been getting through this together for 6 months remotely. And we are at a place of transition. And it's weird to be just looking at your faces on a screen as we talk about this.
I'm also aware that this isn't brand new news to us. So I'm thinking about for you as listeners, that's a lot to hear that Carter is leaving this podcast. And I think we are all having the experience of connecting with our emotions about it in this recording. And we've had some time to process it. So I think I just wanted to name that as well.
Yeah, that's a sweet thing for you to say. It's hard to know who all has been listening to this podcast over all of this time. I feel like we've certainly gotten some feedback, and I know it's impacted a lot of people. And there's also a lot of anonymity in terms of who our listenership is and where they are, and if it matters to them that I'm not going to be on the podcast. I have no idea. So it's really sweet for you to suggest that.
Well, I'm assuming it does matter a lot. And that as the listeners are hearing this, they're going to be going through their own initial reaction and feelings of emotion of that change, because this is what they've been used to having in the appetite is the four of us. And I'm making the assumption that there is connection and attachment to you as the host. And so I'm assuming people are going through their own feelings about that. So I think we've had the privilege of knowing and being able to go through our own immediate responses and have our own kind of process around it before coming live to this conversation.
I did have something I wanted to speak to, just in something I heard you say, Carter, a moment ago, which was that kind of using humor to try to kind of move away from the feeling of the grief. And I just appreciate that feeling so much of wanting to kind of leave the feeling of loss and the feeling of grief, or kind of the discomfort of feeling it. And I guess I think about this episode itself, how we're just the four of us and listeners are going to be moving towards something that sometimes we avoid and actively resist, but is so important, right? Because it gives us it allows us to kind of make sense or kind of understand what's happening, what's changing, and what is different about now versus before, and kind of update our understanding of our worlds. Grief is so important, but so easy to try to avoid and stuff it down and not be in. And I also love this experience of being in this with you as a community, because the work of communal grief is so beautiful, and doing grief together is a different experience than doing grief by yourself in your room at home.
Mhm.
And you can get through grief so much. It feels just so different to get through grief when you're with other people who are grieving as well, and who are sharing in your grief, and you're processing it with them. So I love that's what we're doing today together.
Absolutely.
I also imagine listeners are probably wondering immediately, like, why, or
Yeah,
what
exactly. We
what
haven't
is
mentioned why.
why is this changing? Why is Carter leaving? Like, I can imagine that's what my first reaction was to hearing, like, why? So I think we probably don't want to wait too long to be able to share about
No.
that, because I am imagining that's what the listeners are. That's a question that's coming up right away.
Mhm.
Do you want to share a little bit about that, Carter?
Could I give a little preamble for that,
Sure.
and then I'll lead to you?
Yeah, sure.
So we in Facing Fears at Opal, we do a letting go group, and one of the things we talk about is decision making, and how we make decisions when we have ambivalence and lots of feelings pulling us different ways, and how we often make decisions even though we are maybe 50% sure. So I'd love to hear, Carter, how you've gone about making this decision, and what factors, what ambivalence is there for you, what clarity is there for you, how you made the decision.
Wow. I I think that the simplest answer in terms of why I'm leaving, and I'm grateful for your preamble, Lexi, because I think that it's not simple actually, but the quick answer initially is that I think it's just time for some new growth, and that we've done over 100 episodes, and I have not been working at Opal for about a year and a half now, and it's been such a wonderful way to still be connected to the community. And I also feel like I'm ready to move into some new directions, and I'm not exactly sure what they are yet entirely. Yet I do know that I need sort of this space to be able to dream that up. And as I continue to be invested in this project, it leaves less space to be invested in new ways of thinking about my professional life and my creative life. And so there's nothing entirely concrete about what's next for me, but I think that in terms of the pandemic itself, it's brought a lot of personal changes for me. A lot of life circumstances have changed, and I think within that, it's meant that I've had to do a lot of kind of exploration around which parts of my life need a little bit of pruning. I think things that I've been holding on to for security or familiarity or comfort that maybe aren't serving me in the same way that they were once. So there's stuff about that in terms of just like what my work life looks like. That's meant different things for different relationships beginning and ending. It's meant things about even just my home and the way that I've needed to rearrange my furniture to go, wow, you know what? I actually am watching way more TV than I used to. Like, let's just accept that and move the TV, like let's readjust here. So I don't know. Does that feel like a first layer? I have more to say about that, but does that feel like it clarifies some of the reasoning? Okay.
Yeah,
You're
and
nodding.
I
Yeah.
guess I hear what you're describing as that this is a kind of an emotional. It's more you're following an emotional
Mhm.
lead with these decisions, and less of like a cognitive lead.
Yeah, I am that way. I think that I have always been that way. I feel like I make decisions in a really intuitive gut instinct-oriented way, where I have sort of an awareness of myself or an awareness of a situation, and I let myself watch it kind of evolve, and I really want to grow and evolve, and so I'm paying attention constantly to the ways in which that's able to happen or not happen within a particular setting or friendship or relationship or whatever it is. I've transferred schools. When in my undergraduate, I had went to 3 different schools. Like, I've made some different decisions based off of really needing to kind of follow my own instinct and needs for the sake of growth. And that hasn't always made cognitive sense. I know it probably from the outside sounds like I'm flaky to have gone 3 different places for my undergrad or like don't know what I want, but actually like I think that it's been out of a place of really being attuned to letting myself being complicated and being comfortable with the unknown. I think I am comfortable with the unknown to a big extent. So making this decision has definitely come more from that kind of gut instinct where I'm like, I don't know exactly what's happening next, but I do know that I can't know until I make a different move. And there are cognitive explanations that I can then find for that. But for me, it goes from emotional or bodily to cognitive second.
I really would say I so admire that in you, Carter.
Thanks.
And I would say, like, when you first shared that with us, I immediately felt both, like the loss and the grief of my own experience of not having you a part of this project with us, but then also like this really big respect and admiration of that way of making decisions and tuning into things that you want and being able to pivot and take those risks. Because as someone that doesn't relate to that temperamentally, that's really hard for me to do. So I've been watching my own reaction and seeing your boldness to do that. And I really admire that in you.
Thank you.
And I think that's a loss in our little group too, because I think that's something that perspective is something that's really rich. It makes our podcast rich and brings diversity in that way that I'm going to really be missing that perspective just in these conversations as well.
Thank you.
I think the part that strikes me with it too is that you're willing to go into the unknown and you're comfortable with the unknown. And I think that also feels foreign to me. Like it feels I have some similarities to some of the things that you've shared, but I also, that piece of like not knowing what the next thing would be, not even having really even any frame for it, like is really admirable also. And just, that's in a big way, like in life change or career or path or whatever. But I do think that in the small ways in a conversation and what you might do as in the art of hosting a podcast is some of what you do. You might go into some of the unknown with some questions or take us in some different ways. And I think it is going to be a loss. That's one of the examples of
Thank you.
What will be hard to not have your voice directing and being able to take us different places that we would not have maybe known to go.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I think that what you were just saying, Julie, reminds me of 2 things. The first is Frozen 2, the movie.
Into the unknown.
Yes, exactly. I have been talking about, sort of a lot of different decisions with one of my best friends who is a mother who has a child that is obsessed with Frozen. And I am not typically obsessed with such categories of movies, but she's like, you have to watch Frozen 2. Like you would so appreciate it. If anyone's watched it, it's, sort of the main character is kind of coming into her destiny, and she's hearing this whisper wherever she is that's like calling out to her, and she's terrified of it at first, but she begins to start listening, and she's following this inner voice. She doesn't know it's her inner voice yet, but she starts understanding that it is, and she's called into this sort of greater destiny by listening to this thing that's first really scary and unknown, but winds up being kind of this calling for her. So I relate to that. And I've said this, I think probably a million different times on this podcast and in art therapy over the years when I led art therapy at Opal, and in Shame and Play when I led Shame and Play at Opal. But I really believe in the process of creation, destruction, and recreation. I think I've talked about that before in light of this book called Free Play by Stephen Nekmanovich, which is about improv in life. And he defines sort of this Sanskrit word called lila that's divine play. And it's this process of those three things: creation, destruction, and recreation. And I like to live like that, like that every single thing in our world follows that process. Like, things are created and then they're destroyed and then something new comes. Like, we're in autumn right now. The leaves that had been created over the spring and summer are falling and decaying on the ground, and like new stuff's coming out of the decay. And I think that allows me to feel a lot of freedom in stepping into the unknown and making hard decisions in life, because it's like, until you prune all that stuff to the ground, there's like no new matter to make anything new with. You can't grow unless you let some things be destroyed and acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think that's really remarkable to have that at the front of mind that you've had probably for years, right? Whereas I think and I will speak for myself and maybe for other people, that's not at the front of the mind, but interesting how this time in our world has brought that to the forefront as like a great interruption and destruction. And yet I know for me, that's generally not at the forefront of my mind, of that cyclical nature. So I also wonder, what would it be like if that was something I accepted as a cycle that's really important and valuable as I make decisions? Because I don't think along those. I'm thinking more along those lines now, given what's happening in our world. But it's not something that I've generally thought of in the way that you have. So I think it just sounds very healthy and natural and
It is
natural, like about death, even as we're talking about grief and death and dying, and then the naturalness of that. And yet how often do we try to avoid thinking about destruction and the value of destruction?
That's kind of where I was going with it too. I'm like, I actually am drawn to change. I like change, but to talk about destruction, not necessarily. So it's like change, but then holding on. So holding on to still what was there, and holding on to maybe if it's a continual relationship, like I've moved around a lot, but it's still a desire, and my intention is to still hold on to things. I think when I think about it, not necessarily just let them die. And I think that's actually, if I think about it, and I could do more work in this area, it sounds like, in my heart and mind right now, because I'm like, oh yeah, that probably would be really healthy to let some things die and let the decay, and what would be newness. What is that clogging up in me to kind of be holding on so much of all the things, even though as I anticipate moving and changing and things like that, feels good for me. I actually have a lot of positive feelings around change. I don't think I do it with the destruction and dying part of it too.
Your tree just keeps growing, Julie. You don't cut off the branches. You just grows and gets massive.
But it doesn't do that in nature. That's the problem.
That's not how it works.
Forest fires happen. Yeah. So when's the fire?
I've noticed that in our dynamic as I guess friends and as business owners, that I think I tend to be more comfortable with the deconstruction part of like, this isn't working, we need to move on. This is more about like, let's cut ties and move on. And then I'll feel like Julie and Kara might be more apt to like be wanting to hold on longer than I am. And I think that bears true my personal life as well. I think maybe I have more practice with the deconstruction or just destruction, that things just when things fall apart. So I guess, yeah, I sometimes see holding on when it's not serving us happening at Opal. Holding on too long.
I would agree with that assessment.
I'm so curious what you guys are referring to.
Oh, it's multiple things, Carter. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really interesting to think about, because I think I'm always the first to jump ship on things.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if we want to get into examples.
I actually feel really curious about how you guys would think about like some of the things you've needed to let go of during this season, both in terms of the pandemic, but then also the Black Lives Matter movement. I know that you guys have been making structural changes at Opal. I know that in terms of white identity development in general, I think that there's a process of needing to let go. Actually, racial identity development in general, the way that any person has been kind of whitewashed or internalized whiteness is a process under which we have to let go and first really see what needs to be destroyed. And I think rebuilding is pretty unfathomable in a system like this. So anyway, yeah, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about the pandemic. There's a lot of things to let go of in terms of the pandemic too, and then the intersection of those two. It's like sort of an overwhelming amount of change that we're all being asked to participate in right now in this country.
Well, one thing that I've talked about in the episode where we came off of our hiatus with recording was this idea that I'll be stepping away from clinical leadership, related to the work that we're doing to become an anti-racist organization, but also it's a definite pruning and letting go of cutting branches, and it's totally uncomfortable. And it feels like the biggest change I've made professionally in almost 9 years, which feels like it's not. Yeah, I am really. It's very difficult for me. I relate to what Julie said. It's very difficult for me to cut branches off and to make change. That being said, it's probably a year or so in the making of recognizing the need for change. So I'm doing it. And I think for me, the growing, or the learning and the growing, is I welcome a lot of that in my life. I bring a lot in, but I don't do much of the practice of what needs to be cut off to create more space for the learning. And then I more burn myself out with how much I take on emotionally and change. And that's where Julie and Lexi come in, and they challenge me and they tell me they help try to guide me in some of that. And I'm not the best at that is definitely a challenge. So I think Lexi's very accurate in what she is sharing.
Yeah. It's an interesting example to give in terms of you stepping down from your role, because I know that in a lot of ways that is to create space, right, for leadership from a Black leader. And so that is letting, again, in the space of the unknown, be taken up. It's letting go of power, it's letting go of control. And I think that is incredibly difficult for most people to do. And also comes with, I think, a loss of identity. And there's, I think, an important level of work that needs to happen in that, to go like, you know what, I'm actually going to be okay. And I have like enough of a self, or maybe I don't feel like I have enough, but that's okay. Like I can share the space. I can share this position. I can share the power and have less and tolerate that. And it's a lot of really uncomfortable feelings that have to come up when you choose to let go of something for different reasons.
Well, and I would say one of the things that set me up to be able to do this is I had a lot of focus on my own therapy work to when you share that, I'm not, the difficult part isn't anticipating the identity crisis. It's all of the change that it's requiring and having the capacity for all of that, where I'm not pruning things off to give me the capacity. I'm asking a lot of myself from a demand standpoint that is necessary to make those changes. So that's at least that's how it feels for my lived experience with this so far. And who knows what I'll learn as it keeps going forward. But I think that's the greater challenge for me, rather than kind of going through as much of an identity crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I feel like during this time, the civil rights movement and the pandemic, that there's just, you can't not be receptive and open to the information that's coming at us, right? It just demands attention. And so I feel like that is a really key part of the process of change, is letting the information in about what's happening. Because if you don't do that, then stagnation may occur because you don't have the new information to work with. And then I think about kind of what's been driving us through this time. And Carter and Kara, I think you both spoke to this that change, the motivator for change being growth. And I can feel when that is the reason for the change, you can tolerate a lot of difficulty when it's in the service of recreation or growth and the betterment of the world, and the people around you. So I feel like that's been a driver, and it's just been right with us, and it makes it all tolerable. When you know you're going somewhere that is better than where you were,
Mm-hmm.
you can withstand a lot, and you can tolerate a lot of messiness and ache. And we've definitely been there. It's just a lot of. So I see us where there's a lot of destruction at Opal right now. Our systems are getting, we're just looking at everything differently, and the destruction is all around us.
Yeah. It's striking me as you say that, Lexi, that like, I think as for white women, I think that the privilege of thinking about it as growth is really apparent, because you were just saying in a really beautiful way that like it's impossible to not take in all this new information and not grow. But there are people that choose not to take in information. And I know there are parts of me that still are struggling to not dissociate when it comes to racial violence. Like I have so much in my white body that tells me not to feel everything, that tells me not to pay attention, that tells me, that can separate myself. And I think that happens systemically. That's why we have an issue. But I also I don't know, all of that to say that I think sometimes change happens because it has to, because we're like forced to the brink of something, and not because we consciously get to choose to change. And I know that some of the changes that we're talking about are things that we have choices within, but when you are needing to figure out how to survive, needing to figure out how to make ends meet, needing to figure out how to protect your family, needing to figure out just like something that's so much more of a primal need, base need, it's not a conscious effort toward growth. It is a demand that you figure out something and you figure it out fast. And in that kind of darkness, hopefully there's like a spark of hope where you can see like something beautiful on the other side. But I don't think that everybody gets to hold on to that with a lot of hope, I guess.
Totally. Yeah, that's well said. I think that I can relate to the feeling of times when I am more willing to, it's the choice that my whiteness allows me to have that choice, but then to like engage and take it in and feel and be impacted. And then there's that time when, yes, I might not, right? And I have that choice, which is the thing that I feel like this season has really allowed for me to have clarity that is something that I have as a privilege is with my whiteness, and that I am so oriented towards what is right and what I think is for the betterment of society and others. And so as I realize that it's needing to keep myself close to those moments of discomfort to learn to change and continue this change within my sphere. So if it means within my family, within Opal, within my individual relationships, to then understand what my impact can be in the systems as well as in interpersonal and relational work. So I can relate to what you were saying, Carter, I guess. and that, I don't know, the process of change, when I think of the day-to-day at Opal right now, is facing things that we would never, and challenges and sort of scenarios that we have never been in before. And we're having to make sure that we don't just jump right into the what is, or I'm sorry, the what was, like, oh, well, that's not the way it is supposed to be done. And then, and instead of slowing down and going, okay, well, what about this is going to be that is creating the change within Opal to be able to have this place be different and more inclusive and heal more, starting with those that are marginalized. So I don't know, the change is, all of this is hard to say, I think, because of the privilege that it is. It's tiring. That even doing what I'm doing is tiring, but I also understand that is, with so many layers of my privilege, that it's not tiring like you're talking about primal need tiring of making sure my kids are fed and my child is safe. It's not that. But within my sphere of helping this be a place where those that all could have healing from an eating disorder, it's mental, a ton of mental energy and emotional energy to keep myself not getting back into the old grooves of, well, that's not how it's done. And then say, wait, open up. What's the change here? How are we going to approach this differently than we did before?
Even hearing you talk about that, I think one of the things is that might be, I like the metaphor of pruning, of that needs to be pruned, is that's at least challenging for me, is the pacing, because that does require slowing down and changing the pace, which is, I think, relatable to all of us, and I wonder too for other folks.
What I'm like hearing us distinguish between is change that's a choice and a change that is not your choice, and they're such different experiences, right? I mean, this change that's a choice, where you have the privilege of having resources in which to make the change,
right?
With all this hope and excitement, and there's grief in there too, but there's this direction you're headed. It's a completely different quality than the loss that happens when someone dies, or we want something desperately that we don't have access to. And those are two different experiences of letting go.
Yeah, and I think that letting go can happen internally. Like, there are external things to do. I'm making external changes in my life, but I think there's also a process where that is only, well, there are experiences where that's only ever going to be an internal process. I know that I think about doing work with some of my clients around their family systems, where they're not necessarily choosing to let go of their family. They're not choosing necessarily to cut anybody off, but they are trying to figure out a new way of interacting with family members that have been difficult or caused pain for them. And that letting go process is a holding of both, of like, okay, I am going to still be in this family system, and I can't interact in this way anymore, or I can't have these expectations of my parent anymore, or I, can't hold on to this much rage. I need to figure out a new way to interact. And sometimes that can be like all a change is, which is not to say it's nothing. That's huge. Sometimes to like stay and do that internal work and have to still be within a circumstance that's difficult, whether that's a job or a relationship or anything else, is incredibly difficult task and a challenge to maintain within yourself.
It's just kind of hard to go. I feel like my head can go in circles around this, because I'm like, okay, if it's also internal change, then a lot of times people come to that through therapy or support of somebody else, and the time, and the financial access to do therapy in order to make that internal change. I don't know. I can go in my head loop.
To feel concerned about the accessibility of that to all.
Like what I described as my change, a lot of people wouldn't have access to it because of what I did therapeutically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Most people wouldn't get to do what I did, accessibility wise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and that
I'm
actually
good.
made a profound change in my life, right? And I don't know if I would have been able to make that change without that experience.
And all that we talked about with the holding on, like to have the option of holding on, there's a lot of privilege in that. As far as what we haven't, Carter, I'm wondering if there's more to your experience and story that you would want to say. You're letting go. What you're holding on to.
I think when it comes to letting go of my role on the podcast, it's been such a hard decision to make because I've really valued this space. I've had so much fun. There are parts of me that I've gotten to know through this process that I wouldn't have gotten to know. And ways that I show up in the meetings that we have or in the recordings that we have that I don't see in any other area of my life. And that is, I think, one of the scariest things for me to let go of, because I can be a creature of comfort and can kind of just sort of get in a groove with things and whatever. But like at this point, what my life will look like is mostly just private practice, professionally speaking. And I enjoy that for sure. And there's so much meaning in it. And I don't talk like this when I'm with clients, and I don't get to think like this out loud in other settings. And I enjoy hosting and interviewing, and I like using my brain in this way. And I just like, I worry about sort of, honestly, even if I'll be able to remember what it feels like to be able to do this and then find it elsewhere. I obviously won't find it in this way, but I think that's one of my hopes, to go, okay, there is this new part of me and I want it to be able to exist beyond this. Does that mean, starting my own podcast one day? Or does that mean, getting to learn about the art of interviews and read a book? Or it could mean so many different things in terms of like letting this part of my identity have an outlet elsewhere. But sometimes when you don't have the thing or the structure or the relationships to keep that part of you intact or outwardly expressive, at least, you lose it. C.S. Lewis said something, I forget in what context or book, but he was talking about the loss of a friend and who had died, and talking about not just missing that friend, but also missing the parts of all of his other friends that were still alive that he would never get to see again, because they only came out with this one friend that had passed away. That like sort of the chemistry of this one person being part of the mix changed everybody else. And without that one person, you lose this person's laughter and you lose this person's perspective on this. Like you just lose a lot. So I'm thinking of that within myself, I guess. And know that also within the podcast itself, that there's a particular alchemy that will be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So much good insight into what you're looking at losing or trying to see what is in this next chapter. I think that puts much more eloquent words to the loss that I feel more selfishly around the loss of you too. It is that. It's exactly what you just described. And that's because I think that your maybe ability to navigate a conversation and bring a passion out in me is not going to be there, and Lexi and Kara could ask those questions or get me there too. But I feel like a loss of that. Like, oh, I won't get to maybe be led into some of those passions of mine in this format. So I'm emotional about it, but yeah, I do. I think gratitude for your naming of that in that eloquent way, but definitely also, grief of the loss of that for me.
Thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
I'm glad to know that you felt that way.
That was like the one thing I had written down about saying in this episode.
Oh.
So you queued me up, teed me up
Okay.
nicely.
Good, that's my job.
I think with loss, at least something I always try to do is connect with what I did receive. Even what I did learn and what I valued and what was there. even if the loss is painful and even if it's unwanted or it's wanted, just to sit in the moment of the gratitude of what was. And lots of gratitude to you, Carter.
Thank you.
You will be missed.
Lots of gratitude.
I don't know if I have more words than what they're sharing, but certainly I like what you said, even using the word alchemy, like a chemistry that changes. And I think that's what I've been, I'm much more connected to the loss than I am to what's ahead or what's next.
I know we're going to be in a recreation phase of the podcast moving forward, and I hope you're proud of us, Carter.
Oh, I am. I'm so
As
excited.
you listen in the future, I hope you're proud of us.
Oh, I'm sure I will be. Oh.
So, listeners, you can continue to expect to hear Carter through the end of 2020. So we have several things we've recorded, things we'll release every 2-3 weeks. We're also going to re-release a few episodes that most of you probably haven't heard that we think are gems that are sort of stuck in the archives of our 100+ episodes. So we'll be re-releasing those, and those will also include Carter. So that's kind of what to expect in 2020. And then as we look into 2021, we don't know what we're all, like as Lexi says, we're going to be in a recreation phase. So we will still be here, and we have interest in potentially having a new host. So if you, a listener or somebody out there thinks could be a good host for what this is, please be in touch with us. But also, we may just be playing around a little bit with the three of us, Lexi, Kara, and I, kind of having some conversations and seeing if that could be a platform of learning and growth for you as the listeners and us as well.
I feel myself feeling jealous already. Like, wait, what? Like a new host? I'm listening like a bit distracted by that.
I know. I didn't know if I should say it.
No, it's great. It's great. I'm saying that even out loud for the listeners to know, like, as we talk about this, I don't feel great. It goes back to that ambivalence,
We have an episode on envy, Carter, that you could
good.
listen
I'll listen. I'll listen to my former wisdom in a moment of calm and fewer risks and costs. I think that I would also, like, just as part of this community, and like I said earlier in this episode today, it's hard to know sometimes who is listening. And I would invite any listener to reach out to me if you want to. I think that would mean a lot to me if anyone wants to say hi, or I don't know, what was your favorite episode? I'm just curious. That would mean a lot to me. I have 2 different websites that I think you could find me at through both. One is more arts focused, and it's carterumhau.com, and the other one is more therapy focused, and it's PITH Therapy, PITHTHERAPY.com. So I would love to be in touch with anyone that wants to be in touch.
Holding on.
I am holding on. Holding on. I think that is hopefully, I think for me, a really beautiful thing to know that, like, relationships can continue in some capacity beyond sometimes the structure of what life has provided so far. And that's the way that I prefer to hold on typically, is in those relational connections, even when so many other things change. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and thank you so much for being invested in the podcast in the way that you have been, whether that's been this one episode or you've been following along since the beginning. It has been such an honor to get to be in your ears. Make sure you listen through the rest of 2020, and also to see what's going on the other side of the new year too, as the podcast continues to reinvent itself. Thank you. Like I said, feel free to reach out to me directly. If you want to learn more about Opal, make sure to stay in touch with us on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at Opal Food and Body. You can also learn more about our programming and community events at opalfoodandbody.com. Thank you so much to David Bazzi for editing this episode, to Camille Dodson for all of the assistance and management of the podcast, and to Aaron Davidson for the Appetites original music. Thanks again for listening, and join us next time.